My son-in-law laughed at my cheap Christmas gift. He really did, right there in front of everyone. And in that moment, when his dismissive chuckle filled the room, everything changed, not just for him, but for all of us. I'm glad you're here because this isn't just a story about a gift, it's about a family secret decades old and how one small, unassuming package brought it all crashing down. It's about truth and the uncomfortable way it sometimes reveals itself. It was Christmas Day just last year. The air in our living room was thick with the scent of pine and cinnamon, the usual holiday chaos humming around us. My daughter, Sarah, had painstakingly decorated the tree, every ornament a memory, every light twinkling with the promise of joy. My wife, Carol, was bustling in the kitchen, already planning the next round of snacks, her usual picture of festive cheer. It was, by all appearances, a perfect Christmas morning, the kind you see in movies, the kind you always hope for. Our family tradition is to open gifts one by one, slowly savoring each moment. It stretches out the fun, and honestly, it's just how we've always done it. The kids, my grandkids, they go first, tearing into their presents with unbridled glee, the wrapping paper flying like snow. Then it moves to the adults. There's usually a lot of good-natured teasing, guesses about what's inside, polite compliments. It's always been a warm, predictable rhythm, but I knew this Christmas was going to be different. I'd felt it for months, ever since I decided what I was going to give Mark, Sarah's husband. And I knew exactly how he'd react. He always reacts the same way when something doesn't meet his rather specific expectations. Mark, bless his heart, is a good man in many ways. He loves my daughter, he's a decent father to my grandkids, and he works hard. But he also has this veneer, this polished exterior, a constant need to project an image of success, of having it all. And part of that image for him involves material things. He's never been outright rude about gifts, not to my face anyway, but you can always see it in his eyes, that flicker of disappointment if something isn't quite up to his standards. He's a brand name kind of guy, a latest model kind of guy. And he makes sure everyone knows it subtly, of course. A casual mention of the new car, the designer watch, the exclusive club membership. I've always tried to be generous with Mark, just like I am with Sarah. They're my kids, even if one is by marriage. I've bought him nice watches, power tools he'd mentioned, gift certificates to expensive restaurants. Things that I thought would appeal to his tastes. And he'd always accepted them with a polite smile, a handshake, a thanks, Dad. But there was never that genuine spark, that look of true pleasure you see when someone really loves what they've received. It was always a bit perfunctory. This year, though, I couldn't bring myself to do it again, not after everything I'd learned, everything I'd been carrying. The weight of it had been pressing down on me, making every interaction with Mark feel like a performance, a lie. I couldn't keep pretending everything was normal, not when I held this secret, a secret that directly concerned him, his life, his past. So I decided to give him something that would force the issue, something that would cut through all the pretense, all the polite smiles, and get to the raw truth. I knew it would be uncomfortable, I knew it would probably cause a scene, but I also knew it was necessary. I couldn't hold it in any longer. I'd spent weeks agonizing over it, not just the gift itself, but the timing, the presentation, the words I would or wouldn't say. Carol knew I was preoccupied, a little distant, but she just put it down to the usual Christmas stress. She had no idea the kind of storm I was brewing, the kind of family earthquake I was about to trigger. As the gift opening moved from the grandkids to the adults, the atmosphere was still light. Sarah got a beautiful scarf from Mark, a thoughtful choice. Carol got a new e-reader from me, which she'd been hinting at for months. We laughed, we chatted, the usual holiday cheer. And then it was Mark's turn to open a gift from me. I watched him carefully, a knot tightening in my stomach. The gift was small, wrapped simply in plain brown paper, tied with a bit of twine. No fancy bows, no shiny foil, no elaborate tag, just a simple, almost rustic package. It looked cheap. Intentionally so, I'd made sure of it. I wanted it to stand out against the backdrop of glittering wrapping and expensive boxes. I wanted it to scream unimportant. He picked it up, a slight frown creasing his brow. His eyes, usually so quick to scan for brand logos or impressive weight, lingered on the plainness of it. I saw his gaze flick to Sarah, then back to me, a silent question in his eyes. He probably thought I was having an off year, or maybe I'd forgotten to get him something. And just grabbed whatever was lying around. He gave a little huff, almost imperceptible, as he turned the package over in his hands. Sarah, ever the peacemaker, tried to smooth things over. "Oh, Dad always finds the most unique things, Mark," she said, her voice a little too bright. She probably thought it was some kind of artisanal coffee or a fancy small batch whiskey, something quirky but still high-end. She didn't know, nobody knew. Mark just offered a tight smile, a practiced pleasantry that didn't quite reach his eyes. He started to peel back the tape slowly, deliberately, as if prolonging the inevitable disappointment. The paper came off in neat strips, revealing a plain, unbranded cardboard box underneath. It was one of those generic boxes you get when you order something online from a small, independent seller. Nothing fancy, nothing to hint at anything of value. He took a deep breath, almost a sigh, before opening the lid, and that's when it happened. He peered inside, his face initially blank, then a flicker of confusion, followed by a slow, spreading smirk. His eyes met mine across the room, and then he let out a short, sharp laugh. It wasn't a laugh of amusement or surprise or even genuine disbelief. It was a laugh of dismissive contempt, a laugh that said, "Are you serious? This is what you got me." It cut through the festive atmosphere like a knife. The happy chatter died down. Sarah looked mortified, her cheeks flushing crimson. Carol, who had just walked back in from the kitchen, stopped dead in her tracks, a plate of cookies still in her hands, her brow furrowed with confusion and concern. The grandkids, momentarily distracted from their own toys, looked up, sensing the sudden shift in mood. That laugh, it echoed in the sudden silence, ringing in my ears. It was exactly what I had expected, what I had planned for. But hearing it, seeing his face, feeling the collective discomfort in the room, it still stung. It stung because it confirmed everything I already knew about him, about his priorities, about the superficiality that sometimes overshadowed the good man beneath. But it also solidified my resolve. This wasn't just a cheap gift, it was a key, and he was about to unlock something he never knew existed. He was about to realize that sometimes the cheapest-looking things hold the most profound truths. He was still holding the open box, the dismissive laugh fading from his lips, replaced by a look of bewildered disdain. He hadn't even taken the item out yet. He was just staring at it, this seemingly insignificant object, unable to comprehend why anyone, especially me, would give him something so meager. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions. And then he finally reached in, his fingers closing around the object, pulling it out into the light. He was about to see it. He was about to hold it in his hands, this simple, cheap thing, and have his entire world tilt on its axis. He just didn't know it yet, not even close. Him something at all, that thought, I could almost hear it forming in his mind, like a small, unwelcome crack in the polished facade he so carefully maintained. The air in the living room, though, remained oblivious to the ripple of unease that had just passed between us. It was still thick with that comforting Christmas morning warmth, a blend of freshly brewed coffee, the lingering scent of cinnamon rolls from breakfast, and the crisp, clean smell of the pine tree standing majestic in the corner. Sunlight, pale and watery for a winter's day, slanted through the bay window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the festive glow, catching the glitter on ornaments. Carol was laughing from the kitchen, a bright, clear sound, as she recounted some anecdote to Sarah, who was already on her second cup of tea, curled up on the sofa with a contented sigh. The grandkids, their faces sticky with chocolate from their advent calendars, were busy assembling a new Lego set on the rug, their chatter a low, happy murmur. It was truly a picture of domestic bliss, the kind of scene I'd worked my whole life to build and protect. And I loved it, every predictable, comforting detail of it. I loved watching Sarah, my only daughter, so happy and settled, her life full of the kind of joy I'd always wished for her. I loved Carol, my rock, her presence a constant source of calm and warmth in our home. Even Mark, for all his particularities, was part of this picture, a piece of the puzzle that made our family complete. He was, after all, Sarah's choice, and for that alone he deserved my respect and my efforts to welcome him fully into our lives. He was a tall man, Mark, with a presence that always seemed to fill a room not aggressively but with a quiet confidence and almost magnetic pull. He always dressed impeccably, even on Christmas morning, a crisp button-down shirt, perfectly pressed trousers, never a hair out of place. He had an easy smile, one that reached his eyes. Indeed, he was good with the kids, often getting down on the floor to play with them, his deep laugh echoing through the house. He was, by all accounts, a successful man, a good provider, and he certainly made Sarah happy, which was, to me, the ultimate measure. Our relationship, mine and Mark's, had always been polite, respectful. He called me Dad, which always felt a little strange, a little forced, but I appreciated the gesture. We'd talk about sports, about current events, about the kids' latest achievements. We'd share a beer on the patio in the summer or watch a game together. He'd listen intently when I offered advice, nodding slowly, though I often wondered if any of it ever truly sank in or if it was just another part of the performance. He was always perfectly agreeable, perfectly pleasant, never ruffled, never raising his voice. It was a smooth, well-oiled machine of an interaction, always operating within carefully defined boundaries. But beneath that smooth surface, I'd always sensed a certain distance, a guardedness. It wasn't hostility, not exactly, but more like a subtle barrier, a wall he kept up, even with those closest to him. He was a man who preferred to keep things neat, orderly, and controlled. And emotions, particularly messy ones, seemed to be something he kept firmly under lock and key. I'd seen it in the way he handled minor disappointments. A quick tightening of his jaw, a fleeting shadow in his eyes, quickly smoothed over with a polite smile. It was a trait I'd always observed, tucked away in the back of my mind, something I noticed but never dwelled on, not until recently. Not until I started digging, started asking questions, started uncovering the truth about his past, about his asterisk other asterisk family, the one he rarely, if ever, spoke about. That's when those small observations began to take on a new, more significant meaning, like pieces of a puzzle suddenly clicking into place. And that's when I knew I couldn't just keep buying him expensive watches and pretending everything was fine. So as he stood there holding that plain, unassuming package, the contrast between the simple wrapping and Mark's usual preference for luxury was stark, almost comical. His fingers, usually so adept at untying neat bows and tearing through expensive paper, seemed to hesitate, almost recoil from the rough twine. He turned the package over once, a slow, deliberate movement, as if searching for a hidden label, a brand name tucked away somewhere. His eyes, usually so confident, darted around the room, catching Sarah's eye for a fleeting moment, then mine. It was a silent, almost imperceptible plea, a question hanging in the air. What is this? I offered him a small, neutral smile, trying to keep my own expression unreadable. Inside my stomach was a coiled spring, my heart thrumming a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The peaceful, homely atmosphere of our Christmas morning felt like a fragile bubble stretched thin, threatening to burst. I could feel the weight of the secret pressing down on me, a physical ache in my chest, knowing that in just a few moments this carefully constructed calm would be shattered. He cleared his throat, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, and then, with a forced chuckle that didn't quite reach his eyes, he looked at me. It was a quick, almost dismissive glance, a flash of something I couldn't quite decipher, annoyance, confusion, before his usual polished composure snapped back into place. "Well, Dad," he said, his voice just a touch too loud, a little too jovial, a slight edge to his tone that only I perhaps could discern, "looks like you went for the minimalist approach this year, huh?" He held up the package, not quite mockingly, but with a definite air of polite bewilderment. He then glanced at Sarah again, a quick, almost imperceptible flicker of his eyes, and I saw it then, a subtle, almost imperceptible tightening around his lips. A fleeting moment where his practiced smile didn't quite reach his eyes, a small, telltale sign of his true discomfort, a momentary lapse in his carefully constructed image. And in that brief, unguarded second, I knew he was already bracing himself for disappointment, already concocting a polite way to dismiss whatever humble offering lay beneath the brown paper. Him something at all. That thought, I could almost hear it forming in his mind like a small, unwelcome crack in the polished facade he so carefully maintained. The air in the living room, though, remained oblivious to the ripple of unease that had just passed between us. It was still thick with that comforting Christmas morning warmth, a blend of freshly brewed coffee, the lingering scent of cinnamon rolls from breakfast, and the crisp, clean smell of the pine tree standing majestic in the corner. Sunlight, pale and watery for a winter's day, slanted through the bay window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the festive glow, catching the glitter on ornaments. Carol was Uhing from the kitchen, a bright, clear sound as she recounted some anecdote to Sarah, who was already on her second cup of tea, curled up on the sofa with a contented sigh. The grandkids, their faces sticky with chocolate from their advent calendars, were busy assembling a new Lego set on the rug, their chatter a low, happy murmur. It was truly a picture of domestic bliss, the kind of scene I'd worked my whole life to build and protect. And I loved it, every predictable, comforting detail of it. I loved watching Sarah, my only daughter, so happy and settled, her life full of the kind of joy I'd always wished for her. I loved Carol, my rock, her presence a constant source of calm and warmth in our home. Even Mark, for all his particularities, was part of this picture, a piece of the puzzle that made our family complete. He was, after all, Sarah's choice, and for that alone he deserved my respect and my efforts to welcome him fully into our lives. He was a tall man, Mark, with a presence that always seemed to fill a room not aggressively but with a quiet confidence and almost magnetic pull. He always dressed impeccably, even on Christmas morning, a crisp button-down shirt, perfectly pressed trousers, never a hair out of place. He had an easy smile, one that reached his eyes, and he was good with the kids, often getting down on the floor to play with them, his deep laugh echoing through the house. He was, by all accounts, a successful man, a good provider, and he certainly made Sarah happy, which was, to me, the ultimate measure. Our relationship, mine and Mark's, had always been polite, respectful. He called me Dad, which always felt a little strange, a little forced, but I appreciated the gesture. We'd talk about sports, about current events, about the kids' latest achievements. We'd share a beer on the patio in the summer or watch a game together. He'd listen intently when I offered advice, nodding slowly, though I often wondered if any of it ever truly sank in or if it was just another part of the performance. He was always perfectly agreeable, perfectly pleasant, never ruffled, never raising his voice. It was a smooth, well-oiled machine of an interaction, always operating within carefully defined boundaries. But beneath that smooth surface, I'd always sensed a certain distance, a guardedness. It wasn't hostility, not exactly, but more like a subtle barrier, a wall he kept up, even with those closest to him. He was a man who preferred to keep things neat, orderly, and controlled. And emotions, particularly messy ones, seemed to be something he kept firmly under lock and key. I'd seen it in the way he handled minor disappointments. A quick tightening of his jaw, a fleeting shadow in his eyes, quickly smoothed over with a polite smile. It was a trait I'd always observed, tucked away in the back of my mind, something I noticed but never dwelled on, not until recently. Not until I started digging, started asking questions, started uncovering the truth about his past, about his other family, the one he rarely, if ever, spoke about. That's when those small observations began to take on a new, more significant meaning, like pieces of a puzzle suddenly clicking into place. And that's when I knew I couldn't just keep buying him expensive watches and pretending everything was fine. So as he stood there, holding that plain, unassuming package, The contrast between the simple wrapping and Mark's usual preference for luxury was stark, almost comical. His fingers, usually so adept at untying neat bows and tearing through expensive paper, seemed to hesitate, almost recoil from the rough twine. He turned the package over once, a slow, deliberate movement, as if searching for a hidden label, a brand name tucked away somewhere. His eyes, usually so confident, darted around the room, catching Sarah's eye for a fleeting moment, then mine. It was a silent, almost imperceptible plea, a question hanging in the air. What is this? I offered him a small, neutral smile, trying to keep my own expression unreadable. Inside my stomach was a coiled spring, my heart thrumming a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The peaceful, homely atmosphere of our Christmas morning felt like a fragile bubble stretched thin, threatening to burst. I could feel the weight of the secret pressing down on me, a physical ache in my chest, knowing that in just a few moments this carefully constructed calm would be shattered. He cleared his throat, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, and then, with a forced chuckle that didn't quite reach his eyes, he looked at me. It was a quick, almost dismissive glance, a flash of something I couldn't quite decipher, annoyance, confusion, before his usual polished composure snapped back into place. "Well, Dad," he said, his voice just a touch too loud, a little too jovial, a slight edge to his tone that only I perhaps could discern. "Looks like you went for the minimalist approach this year, huh?" He held up the package, not quite mockingly, but with a definite air of polite bewilderment. He then glanced at Sarah again, a quick, almost imperceptible flicker of his eyes, and I saw it then, a subtle, almost imperceptible tightening around his lips, a fleeting moment where his practiced smile didn't quite reach his eyes, a small, telltale sign of his true discomfort, a momentary lapse in his carefully constructed image. And in that brief, unguarded second, I knew he was already bracing himself for disappointment, already concocting a polite way to dismiss whatever humble offering lay beneath the brown paper. I had spent months researching, quietly, discreetly. After an offhand comment Mark made about his estranged father years ago, a fleeting mention of not being in the picture quickly changed subject. A seed of curiosity had been planted. But it was only recently, when I started seeing patterns in Mark's behavior, that I truly began to dig. His almost desperate need for material validation, his subtle disdain for anything less than perfect, his guardedness around his past, it all started to feel like overcompensation, like he was running from something, trying to bury a truth he couldn't face. I began with public records, old newspaper archives, anything I could access online without raising suspicion. It was a slow, painstaking process, like sifting through sand for a single grain of gold. There were dead ends, false leads, moments when I almost gave up, telling myself it wasn't my place, that some secrets were best left buried. But then I'd see Mark again, that carefully constructed facade, that underlying tension in his eyes, and I knew I had to keep going. He deserved to know, even if the truth was painful. My first real breakthrough came in a small, almost forgotten online forum dedicated to regional folk art. Someone had posted about a local craftsman from a small town a few hours north, a man known for his simple, heartfelt wooden carvings, particularly birds. The name mentioned, Thomas Miller asterisk, didn't immediately ring any bells. But the description of his work, the way he never sought fame or fortune, how he lived a life of quiet humility, resonated with something I was looking for, a stark contrast to everything Mark seemed to embody. I dug deeper into Thomas Miller. Old local newspaper clippings started to surface, mostly small articles about community events, craft fairs, or mentions in local interest pieces. They painted a picture of a man who was gentle, talented, but also deeply unlucky, always struggling to make ends meet. He was known for selling his carvings for next to nothing, sometimes even giving them away to children who admired them. The word cheap echoed in my mind, not as an insult, but as a descriptor of his life, his art, his values. It was the antithesis of Mark's world. Then came the more difficult discoveries. There was a period, a gap in the newspaper mentions, a sudden absence from the community events. It was harder to trace, requiring calls to dusty county courthouses, discreet inquiries to historical societies. The truth, when it finally emerged, hit me like a physical blow. Thomas Miller, Mark's father, had served time, not for anything violent, not for anything truly malicious, but for a series of small-time thefts, born, it seemed, out of desperation to provide for his young family. He'd been caught trying to sell some of his own carvings, falsely claiming they were antique, a desperate attempt to fetch a higher price. It was a foolish, sad act driven by poverty, not greed, but it had landed him in prison. And there, in a small, almost microscopic footnote in an old prison newsletter, was a mention of his continued carving, his hands finding solace in shaping wood, creating those same small birds, robins mostly, which he called messengers of hope. He'd often trade them with guards or send them home to his family, simple tokens of love and regret from behind bars. The wooden bird Mark had just dismissed as a summer camp project was not just asterisk like his father's work. It was asterisk one of his father's creations, a relic from a time of shame and sorrow. I had found an old, faded photograph of one of Thomas Miller's prison carvings, taken by a local reporter for a human interest piece. It was unmistakably this bird, the same crude but heartfelt shape, the same distinct tool marks. The weight of that knowledge holding this simple wooden bird knowing its true origin had been almost unbearable. It wasn't just a piece of wood, it was a silent scream, a forgotten plea, a tangible link to a past Mark's mother had meticulously erased, desperate to give her son a clean slate, a respectable life. She had remarried, quickly changed Mark's last name, and buried every trace of Thomas Miller, every memory of that painful, shameful chapter. She wanted Mark to believe his father had simply vanished, a blank space in his history, easier to accept than the truth of his peak. Overtie and incarceration. I picked up the bird from the coffee table, my fingers tracing the smoothed contours, the rough edges, the marks of a man's desperate hands. My voice when I spoke was low, but it cut through the lingering festive hum in the room. "This isn't just asterisk any asterisk wooden bird, Mark," I said, my gaze fixed on him. The air seemed to solidify, the light chatter dying in an instant. Sarah and Carol, sensing the shift, fell silent, watching me with wide, questioning eyes. Mark's dismissive smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of irritation, then a dawning unease. He tried to recover, a nervous chuckle catching in his throat. "Oh, is it? A special kind of wood then, Dad, an exotic species, perhaps?" He was still trying to find a material value, still trying to categorize it, to control the narrative. But his eyes, usually so steady, darted away from mine, a telltale sign of his growing discomfort. "No, Mark, it's not about the wood," I said, my voice unwavering. "It's about the hands that carved it. Do you remember your father, Mark, what he did?" I watched his face, the subtle tightening around his jaw. I saw the wall go up, brick by invisible brick. "What are you talking about, Dad?" he snapped, his voice sharper than I'd ever heard it. "My father wasn't a wood carver. He left when I was young. He was never in the picture, you know that." He shot a glance at Sarah as if for support, a silent plea for her to intervene. Sarah, however, looked utterly bewildered, her eyes flicking between us, her brow furrowed with worry. Carol, from the kitchen doorway, took a step forward, her hand reaching out as if to physically stop the unfolding disaster. "He was Mark Thomas Miller, your father. He was quite well known in his small town for a time. For his hands," I continued, ignoring their unspoken pleas. "He had a gift for shaping wood, for bringing life to simple things. He specialized in small birds, Mark. Robins were his favorite. He called them messengers of hope." I saw a flicker in his eyes then, a subtle shift, as if a long-forgotten memory had brushed against the edges of his consciousness. Mark pushed himself up from the sofa, a sudden, jerky movement. He began to pace in front of the tree, his hands clenched at his sides. This is ridiculous. You've got the wrong man. My mother never spoke of him. He was a ghost. She built a new life, a good life for us. His voice was tight, strained, the polished veneer beginning to crack, revealing the raw fear beneath. She did, I conceded, my voice softening just a fraction, because she wanted to protect you. She wanted to shield you from the truth, from the shame she felt. But the truth, Mark, has a way of finding its way out, doesn't it? I held up the wooden bird, letting the pale winter light catch its rough surface. He learned to carve these, Mark, while he was inside. The word hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Inside, it was a single word, but its impact was like a physical blow. Mark stumbled, his hand shooting out to grab the edge of the coffee table, his knuckles white. His face, which had been flushed with anger, drained of all color, leaving him ghostly pale. His breath hitched, a raw guttural sound that tore through the festive silence. The carefully constructed image, the confident man, the successful son-in-law, shattered before our eyes. Inside, Dad, what are you saying? Sarah's voice was a raw whisper filled with dawning horror. She looked at Mark, then back at me, her eyes wide with fear and disbelief. Carol stepped fully into the living room, her face etched with concern, her hand now resting gently on Sarah's arm. Honey, maybe this isn't the time. She started, her voice pleading, but it was the time. There was no going back, no softening the blow. He served time, Mark, I said, my voice firm, though my heart ached for him. For petty theft, he was desperate. He tried to sell his carvings, claiming they were something they weren't, just to put food on the table for you and your mother. It was a foolish mistake, but it cost him years of his life, and it cost him his family. I continued, the words spilling out, each one a nail in the coffin of Mark's carefully constructed past. This bird, I said, holding it out towards him, this was one of the ones he carved in prison. He sent it to your mother for you, a message from behind those walls, a father's desperate attempt to connect with the son he was losing. But she buried it, Mark, she buried all of it, to give you a fresh start, to give you the kind of life she thought you deserved, free from the shadow of his mistakes. Mark stood frozen for a moment, his eyes wide and vacant, staring at the bird in my hand as if it were a venomous snake. His hands trembled uncontrollably. The implications, the betrayals, the decades of lies, the shame, the lost connection, it all crashed down on him at once. He saw the rough wood, the marks of the tool, the smooth places where a desperate man's thumb had worn away the surface, and in it he saw his father's struggle, his love, his profound regret. A raw, guttural sound escaped his throat, a choked sob that tore through the silence. No, this isn't possible, he whispered, his voice broken, barely audible. He didn't take the bird. Instead, his eyes, swimming with unshed tears, finally met mine, and in them I saw not anger, but a profound, devastating anguish. He slowly sank to his knees, his hands coming up to cover his face, his shoulders shaking with the force of his silent sobs. He was utterly broken, his carefully constructed world imploded, leaving behind only the dust of a shattered truth. The room was utterly silent save for that heartbreaking sound, the sound of a man confronting a lifetime of lies, a ghost of a father he never knew, and the hollow man he became trying to outrun it all. He tried to recover, a nervous chuckle catching in his throat, a faint smile warring with the unease that was rapidly spreading across his face. "All right, Dad, you've got my attention," he said, trying to inject a lightness into his voice that wasn't quite there. He glanced at Sarah, then at Carol, a quick, almost imperceptible plea for them to diffuse whatever strange turn this Christmas morning was taking. But they were both silent, their eyes fixed on me, sensing the shift, the sudden, heavy weight in the air. The festive hum had indeed died, replaced by a stillness that felt almost unnatural. I didn't rush. I took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the silence stretch, letting the anticipation build. This wasn't about theatrics, not exactly, but it was about impact. It was about ensuring that every word I spoke, every truth I laid bare, would land with the full force of its meaning. For months I had carried this, a heavy, uncomfortable burden, and now finally the moment had arrived to set it down. And I knew deep down that this was necessary. Not just for Mark, but for Sarah, for our family, for the integrity of the life we were all building together. Mark's carefully constructed world, his polished exterior, his almost desperate need for external validation, it had always felt like a house built on sand. And the truth, no matter how painful, was the only foundation solid enough to hold a real life, a real self. He deserved to know where he came from, who he was, beyond the surface he presented to the world. My planning had been meticulous, a silent campaign waged over months, each step weighed, each piece of information carefully considered. It began with the initial seed of doubt, that offhand comment Mark had made years ago about his father, quickly brushed aside. It had festered quietly in the back of my mind, a small nagging question that refused to be silenced. Then, as I observed Mark more closely, saw the subtle cracks in his confident facade, the way he flinched from vulnerability, the way he clung to material possessions as a shield, that question grew into a conviction. There was something missing, something he was running from, and it was shaping him in ways he couldn't even see. I had started my research almost casually, a few late-night searches on the internet, a name here, a town there. But as the pieces slowly began to connect, as the outline of Thomas Miller, his father, started to emerge from the shadows of the past, my casual curiosity transformed into a quiet, unwavering resolve. It became less about satisfying my own curiosity and more about a mission. A mission to uncover a truth that had been unjustly buried, a life that had been deliberately erased. I remember sitting alone in my study, late into the night, poring over those old newspaper clippings, the faded photographs, the dusty court records. Each discovery was a jolt, a pang in my chest. The story of Thomas Miller, a man of simple talents and profound misfortune, struggling against poverty, driven to desperate acts. And then the prison records, the small, almost heartbreaking detail of him carving those little wooden birds behind bars, sending them home, messengers of hope. Each piece of information was like a chisel mark on my own heart, carving away at my assumptions, deepening my understanding. This wasn't about malice, not truly. It was about a kind of cold, deliberate justice. Mark had built his entire identity on the erasure of this man, on the rejection of this humble, flawed legacy. He had sought to elevate himself by distancing himself from what he perceived as shame. And in doing so, he had denied a part of himself, a fundamental truth that, whether he liked it or not, was woven into the fabric of his being. I believed with every fiber of my being that to deny one's past, however painful, was to live an incomplete life. I had gathered more than just the story of the bird. I had collected a small, carefully curated dossier. There was a faded copy of a local newspaper article from the early '80s. A human interest piece about Thomas Miller, the local woodcarver, that included a blurry photograph of him, younger, with kind eyes, holding one of his robin carvings. There was a copy of the court transcript detailing the petty thefts, the desperate plea, the short prison sentence. And there was a copy of a letter written from prison addressed to my dearest Mark, a child's name, filled with clumsy, heartfelt apologies and the promise of a wooden bird. I had even found a small, almost illegible sketch of a robin drawn on the back of the letter, a crude outline that matched the bird in my hand. These weren't just documents, they were fragments of a life, fragments of a father's love, however imperfectly expressed. They were the tangible proof, the undeniable reality that Mark had been shielded from for so long. And I knew with chilling clarity that these pieces of paper, combined with that small wooden bird, would shatter the comfortable narrative he had always believed. I had considered how this would affect Sarah, my daughter. She loved Mark, and this truth would undoubtedly cause her pain, perhaps even resentment towards me for unearthing it. But I also knew Sarah. She was strong, resilient, and she valued honesty above all else. She deserved a partner who was whole, who understood himself, not one who was constantly running from his own shadow. This truth, I rationalized, however harsh, would ultimately make their foundation stronger or reveal it to be weaker than they thought. Either way, it was better than a lie. Carol, my wife, was a different matter. Her gentle nature, her fierce protectiveness of our family meant she would likely be devastated. She would see the potential for hurt, for division. I had kept her completely in the dark, knowing she would try to stop me, would try to protect everyone from the impending storm. But this was a storm that needed to break. The air had been too heavy, too stagnant with unspoken history. I remembered the day I found the letter, crumpled and almost discarded in an old box of local historical society donations. The handwriting was unrefined, the grammar imperfect, but the sentiment was raw, aching. "My dearest Mark," it began. "I am so sorry. I hope you know I love you. I am carving you a robin, a messenger of hope, to remind you that even in the darkest times there is always a way back to the light." Your pa reading those words, seeing the child's name, feeling the weight of that forgotten love solidified my resolve. This wasn't just about Mark's perception of cheapness. It was about the profound value of a father's desperate, flawed love. I had envisioned this moment, rehearsed it in my mind countless times. The exact words I would use, the order in which I would present the evidence, the calm, unwavering tone I would maintain. I wouldn't accuse, I wouldn't condemn. I would simply present the facts, allow the truth to speak for itself, and let Mark draw his own conclusions. This wasn't my revenge, not really. It was his reckoning. My gaze settled on Mark again. He was still trying to project an air of polite amusement, but the corners of his mouth were twitching and his eyes had lost their usual confident gleam. He was unsettled, profoundly so. The carefully constructed walls he had built around his past were about to be breached, and he could feel the tremors. I took another slow breath, the wooden bird still resting in my palm, warm from my touch. Its rough surface, its simple form, felt incredibly powerful now, a tiny, unassuming key to a locked past. "Mark," I said, my voice quiet, clear, cutting through the heavy silence. "This bird was carved by your father." His eyes widened, the polite smile vanishing completely. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Sarah gasped softly beside him, her hand flying to her mouth. Carol, from the kitchen doorway, let out a small, choked sound, her eyes fixed on me in horror and dawning understanding. The carefully cultivated calm of our Christmas morning had finally shattered, not with a bang, but with a whisper. "His name was Thomas Miller," I continued, my voice unwavering, "and he carved this for you when you were just a boy." I paused, letting the words hang in the air, letting them sink in, knowing they were just the first drops of the storm. He called them messengers of hope. That small wooden bird, that dossier, they weren't just objects anymore, they were weapons. Precision-guided missiles aimed straight at the fortress Mark had built around himself. I didn't move. I just stood there, the weight of the old papers in my hand, the small, crude carving in the other. Mark watched me, his eyes narrowed, that fake smile finally gone, replaced by a tense, wary frown. Sarah and Carol were frozen, silent witnesses to a scene they couldn't comprehend. The air was thick, heavy, charged. "This bird," I began, my voice clear, steady, cutting through the silence like a knife. "This isn't from summer camp, Mark. It was carved by your father." The words hung there, suspended. Mark blinked. A flicker of something, confusion, anger, disbelief, crossed his face so quickly I almost missed it. He scoffed, a short, sharp sound, almost a snort. "My father," he said, a dismissive wave of his hand. "My father wasn't a woodcarver, Dad. He wasn't in the picture, you know that." His voice was tight, a little too loud. He was trying to regain control, to deflect. To pretend I was mistaken, but I wasn't mistaken. I knew too much. I held up the faded newspaper clipping first. It was brittle, yellowed, folded carefully. The headline was simple: "Local artisan finds solace in wood." Beneath it, a blurry black and white photo. A younger man, maybe in his late 20s or early 30s, with kind, tired eyes, a faint stubble on his chin, holding up a small, unmistakable wooden robin. The very same bird, only newer, less worn. "This is Thomas Miller," I said, my gaze locked on Mark. "Your father, from an article in the local paper, October 1982. Mark's eyes widened just a fraction. He took a step back, his head shaking almost imperceptibly. He wanted to look away, I could tell. He wanted to dismiss it, but the image, the face, the bird, it was too specific, too real. Sarah gasped softly beside him. Carol pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. They saw it too, the resemblance. The undeniable link, Mark stammered. That's not him. I don't know who that is. But his voice lacked conviction. It was a desperate, flailing attempt to deny the undeniable. His face was pale, a cold sweat beading on his forehead. I didn't press. I just laid the newspaper clipping on the coffee table right next to the little wooden bird. The photo stared up at him, a silent accusation from a forgotten past. Then I held up the next document, the court transcript. Pages of dry, legal jargon, but the core of it was stark. County of Millhaven versus Thomas Miller. The date, the charges, petty theft, multiple counts, desperation. And this, I continued, my voice unwavering, is the court record, details of his arrest and conviction. He was trying to sell his carvings, Mark, claiming they were antiques, trying to get enough money to survive, to provide. Mark snatched the document, his hands trembling slightly. He scanned it, his eyes racing across the words as if searching for an escape clause, a loophole, anything to disprove what he was seeing. His jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. He muttered something under his breath, a choked, angry sound. "No," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "No, this is a mistake. You've got the wrong person." He looked up, his eyes blazing with a mixture of fear and rage. "What is this, Dad? What are you trying to do?" He was cornered, and he was lashing out. Sarah stepped forward, her hand reaching for his arm. "Mark, what is it? What's he talking about?" Her voice was laced with genuine fear now, the fear of the unknown, of a foundation crumbling beneath her feet. I ignored his question, ignored Sarah's plea. I had to finish this. The truth had to be fully exposed, unvarnished. I pulled out the last document, the letter, fragile, creased, the ink faded with time. It was the hardest one to hold, the one that carried the most emotional weight. "This," I said, my voice softer now but no less firm, "this is a letter written from prison to you, Mark." His eyes snapped to the letter, then back to my face. The rage was still there, but it was now mixed with a raw, primal fear, the kind of fear that strips away all pretense, all carefully constructed masks. "It's dated June 1985, I continued, my gaze holding his, "and it's addressed to my dearest Mark." I paused, letting those words sink in. My dearest Mark. A father's words from behind bars to a son he couldn't reach, couldn't touch. Mark's breath hitched. He stared at the letter, his chest heaving. He wanted to deny it, I could see it in his eyes, but he couldn't, not anymore. The pieces were locking into place, each one a hammer blow to his carefully constructed reality. "He talks about missing you," I read aloud, my voice low, steady, "about how he thinks of you every day. He says he's making something for you with his hands, something to remind you that he loves you even when he can't be there." I pointed to the crude sketch on the back of the letter, a simple outline of a robin, unmistakable, identical to the bird sitting on our coffee table. "He promised you a wooden bird, Mark, a messenger of hope. He sent it to you from prison, this very bird." The silence that followed was deafening. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the heavy, suffocating weight of a lifetime of suppressed truth. Mark stood utterly still, his eyes wide, fixed on the letter, then on the bird, then on the old newspaper photo of his father. His face, usually so composed, so polished, crumpled. Color drained from it, leaving him ashen. His lips parted, but no sound came out. He looked like a man who had just been struck repeatedly by an invisible force. His whole body began to tremble, visibly, uncontrollably. Sarah let out a small sob, covering her mouth with both hands. Carol had tears streaming down her face, a silent testament to the raw pain unfolding before her. Even the grandkids, sensing the profound shift, had stopped their playing, their young eyes wide with confusion and a dawning sense of gravity. Mark slowly reached out a hand, his fingers shaking violently, and picked up the small wooden bird from the coffee table. He held it, not dismissively now, but reverently, as if it were the most precious, most fragile thing in the world. He turned it over in his palm, his thumb tracing the rough, worn wood, the same marks his father's hands had made, the same texture his father's fingers had smoothed over decades ago. He looked at the bird, then at the photograph of Thomas Miller, then back at the letter. The pieces weren't just clicking into place, they were colliding, shattering the carefully constructed narrative of his life. The cheap gift, the summer camp project, was a direct link to the man he had been taught to forget, the man whose poverty and shame had been so meticulously erased. His father, the man he knew nothing about, the man who had carved this simple token of love from behind prison bars, the man who was anything but the successful, polished image Mark strove to project. His eyes, usually so guarded, so controlled, filled with a torrent of emotions. Humiliation, yes, but also a profound, aching sorrow, a sense of loss so deep it seemed to physically buckle him. He swayed on his feet, his shoulders slumping forward. He had been told his father vanished. He had been given a blank slate, but this was not a blank slate. This was a life, a history, a legacy, however flawed, that had been deliberately hidden from him. This bird, this simple, unassuming piece of wood, was a silent scream from the past, a truth that refused to stay buried. And his own reaction, his dismissive laugh, his casual contempt for something so simple, so unpretentious, it now echoed in the room, a cruel, ironic counterpoint to the profound love and desperation that had forged the gift. He had laughed at his father's love, he had scorned his own history. The air in the room was suffocating, Mark's breathing became ragged, shallow. He clutched the bird to his chest, his knuckles white. His carefully constructed world had just imploded, not with a bang, but with the quiet, devastating weight of a small wooden robin. The man who valued brands and luxury above all else now held the most cheap and worthless item, and it was crushing him under its true, immeasurable value. He raised his head slowly, his eyes meeting mine. They were no longer angry, no longer dismissive. They were broken, lost. And in them I saw a question, a plea, a dawning, terrifying realization of just how much he didn't know about himself, about his past, about the man he had become, built on a foundation of lies. The truth, raw and brutal, was finally out, and it had ripped him open. He loved you. The words hung in the air, a silent, devastating echo. Mark didn't just flinch, he recoiled as if struck. His hands, which had been clutching the letter, suddenly lost their grip. The fragile paper fluttered to the floor, landing silently on the discarded wrapping paper, a stark white against the festive reds and greens. His face was no longer pale, it was ashen, drained of all color, his eyes wide and vacant, staring at something only he could see. The carefully constructed edifice of his life, the one he had meticulously built brick by polished brick, was crumbling before our eyes. He didn't make a sound, not a cry, not a shout, not even a whisper of denial. It was as if the air had been sucked out of him, leaving him hollow. His gaze dropped from my face to the fallen letter, then to the small wooden bird still resting on the coffee table, a mute witness to the unfolding tragedy. His chest rose and fell in ragged, shallow breaths like a man who had just run a marathon but without moving an inch. Sarah, who had been standing a step behind him, reached out, her hand hovering uncertain. "Mark," she murmured, her voice soft, tentative, laced with a fear I hadn't heard from her before. She looked at me, her eyes pleading for an explanation, for a way to undo what had just happened. But there was no undoing this. The truth, once spoken, takes on a life of its own. Carol, my wife, had moved closer, her usual bustling energy replaced by a stillness that was almost eerie. Her face was a mask of distress, her gaze fixed on Mark, then briefly on me. I saw a flicker of reproach in her eyes, a silent question, was this truly necessary? But beneath that, I also saw a deep understanding, a quiet recognition of the weight of history that had just been unburdened. She knew, perhaps better than anyone, the enduring power of family secrets. The living room, moments before filled with the gentle hum of Christmas cheer, was now suffocatingly silent. The scent of pine and cinnamon seemed to curdle, replaced by the sharp tang of unspoken grief and shattered illusions. Even the grandkids who had been quietly playing seemed to sense the shift. They looked up from their Lego, their young eyes wide and curious, sensing the profound shift in the adult atmosphere. They didn't understand, not truly, but they felt the tension, the sudden heavy stillness that had fallen over the room. I felt tired, utterly, profoundly tired. The adrenaline that had propelled me through months of research and the tension of this morning's confrontation drained out of me, leaving behind a vast, empty ache. There was no triumph, no sense of satisfaction in seeing Mark's carefully constructed world fall apart. Only a deep, weary sorrow for the pain I had undoubtedly caused and a somber conviction that it had been necessary. A truth, no matter how painful, was always better than a lie. Always. Mark finally moved. Slowly, deliberately, he sank onto the sofa, his shoulders slumping, his head bowed. He picked up the wooden bird, his fingers tracing its crude contours, the same rough edges his father's hands had shaped. His thumb brushed over the unvarnished wood, a silent caress. He didn't look up, didn't speak. He just sat there, a man adrift, lost in the sudden, overwhelming current of a past he never knew. Sarah sat beside him, gently putting an arm around his shoulders. She didn't try to make him talk, didn't offer platitudes. She just held him, her presence a silent anchor in his storm. She looked at me again, her eyes filled with a new kind of pain, a pain that went beyond Mark's immediate distress. It was the pain of realizing a deeper, hidden layer to the man she loved, a layer she hadn't known existed. His mother, I said, my voice quiet, almost a whisper, breaking the heavy silence. She remarried quickly. She wanted to give you a fresh start, Mark, a clean slate. She changed your last name. She wanted to protect you from the shame, from the hardship. She buried it all. It wasn't an excuse but an explanation, a way to frame the choices that had led to this moment. His mother, I had learned, was a strong woman, fiercely protective, driven by a deep love for her son. She had done what she thought was best, in a time when poverty and a prison record carried a far heavier stigma. Her actions, though ultimately misguided, had come from a place of love, however flawed. Mark finally stirred, a low, guttural sound escaping his lips. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot raw. There was no anger now, only a profound, bottomless grief. All these years, he choked out, his voice hoarse, barely audible. All these years I thought he just left, just vanished, didn't care. He looked at the wooden bird in his hand, then back at me, a question burning in his eyes. This was for me. I nodded, my throat tight. He called them messengers of hope. He sent them home when he could. He wanted you to know he loved you. He never stopped. The words seemed to break something open inside him. A single tear tracked a path down his ashen cheek, followed by another, and then a silent, desperate torrent. He didn't sob loudly, didn't wail. It was a quiet, heartbreaking cascade, the release of decades of unspoken pain, of a son grieving a father he had unknowingly lost twice over. Once to prison, and once to a carefully constructed lie. Sarah held him tighter, her own tears now falling freely. She looked at me, and this time the reproach in her eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet understanding, a shared sorrow. She knew in that moment that what I had done, however painful, had been an act of love, a brutal, necessary love. The rest of that Christmas day was a blur of quiet distress. The festive meal went largely untouched. The grandkids were gently ushered away by Carol, who tried to restore some semblance of normalcy for them, knowing they were too young to bear the weight of such adult sorrow. Mark remained on the sofa for a long time, the wooden bird clutched in his hand, Sarah by his side. They talked quietly at first, then in hushed, broken whispers, rebuilding their shared history, one painful truth at a time. I offered to leave them, but Sarah shook her head, a silent request for me to stay, to be present, to witness. It was hard, it was messy, it was everything Mark usually avoided. And yet in that raw, vulnerable state, he seemed more real, more human than I had ever seen him. The polished veneer was gone, stripped away by the harsh glare of truth, leaving behind a man who was deeply, profoundly hurting, but also finally open. The next few weeks were difficult. Mark went through a period of intense withdrawal. He barely left the house, canceling meetings, eating into himself. There was a quiet anger, a simmering resentment, not just at his mother for the deception, but at the world, at fate, at the injustice of it all. He was grieving not only for the father he had lost, but for the childhood he had been denied, the identity he had been forced to construct. Our relationship, mine and Mark's, was strained. He didn't lash out at me directly, but there was a palpable distance, a coldness. He saw me as the catalyst, the one who had shattered his peace, however false that peace had been. I understood. I didn't expect gratitude. I only hoped in time he would understand the deeper intention. Sarah was incredible. She became his rock, his confidant. She listened, she held him, she helped him process the layers of grief and anger. She also quietly started digging into her own understanding of Mark's past, asking me questions, trying to piece together the narrative for herself. She was hurt that I had kept such a significant secret from her, but she also saw the necessity, the ultimate good that had come from the painful revelation. Her love for Mark, I realized, was deeper and more resilient than I had ever given it credit for. It wasn't just for the polished exterior, it was for the flawed, vulnerable man beneath. Carol, too, eventually came around. After an initial period of quiet disapproval, she saw the profound change in Mark. She saw the new vulnerability, the genuine emotion that began to surface. She understood that sometimes the hardest truths are the ones that set us free. She became a source of quiet support, making sure Mark and Sarah had space, but also reminding them that they were not alone. Slowly, painstakingly, things began to shift. Mark started to talk, not just to Sarah, but to me in hesitant, halting conversations. He asked about his father, about the kind of man he was, about his struggles, his talents. He wanted to know everything. He spent hours looking at the old newspaper clippings, the court records, the faded letter. He asked me to take him to the small town where his father had lived, where he had carved. We went, just the two of us, a quiet, somber pilgrimage. We walked the streets, visited the old general store where Thomas Miller used to sell his wares, stood by the river where he used to find his wood. It was a pilgrimage of understanding, of acceptance. The wooden bird, the one he had once dismissed as a summer camp project, became his most prized possession. He kept it on his desk, not hidden away, but prominently displayed. It was no longer a symbol of shame or a cheap gift. It was a tangible link to his roots, a reminder of a father's flawed, desperate love. What changed? Everything and nothing. The Mark I knew, the polished, guarded man, slowly began to recede. In his place, a more authentic, more grounded individual emerged. He still worked hard, still provided for his family, but the desperate need for external validation, the subtle disdain for anything less than perfect, began to fade. He became less concerned with brand names and more with genuine quality, with things that held meaning, not just monetary value. He laughed more freely, his smile reaching his eyes, and he wasn't afraid to show vulnerability, to admit when he was struggling. He was still Mark, but he was a Mark with a deeper foundation, a more complete understanding of himself. What was lost? We lost the illusion of a perfect, uncomplicated past. We lost the easy, superficial politeness that had characterized my relationship with Mark. We lost a certain kind of innocence, a comfortable ignorance. And for Mark, he lost the idealized blank slate he had believed was his history. But these were losses that ultimately paved the way for something far more valuable. What stayed? The love between Sarah and Mark deepened, forged in the crucible of shared truth and vulnerability. Our family, though scarred by the revelation, emerged stronger, more honest. The quiet, enduring love that binds us remained, now stripped of pretense, built on a foundation of reality. The memory of Thomas Miller, once erased, was now acknowledged, honored, a part of Mark's story, not a footnote to be forgotten. The sentence rhythm in our lives slowed down too, mirroring the quiet processing, the deliberate rebuilding. The hurried pace of striving and performing gave way to a more thoughtful, reflective existence. There was a peace now, a tired but profound peace in knowing the truth, in living openly. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape irrevocably altered but also cleared, ready for new growth. I often think about that Christmas morning, the moment Mark laughed at that simple wooden bird. It was a terrible moment, filled with pain and confrontation. But it was also the beginning of something real, something truly meaningful. It was the moment a son finally met his father, not in person, but in the quiet, enduring message of a small, hand-carved robin. And in that eating, he began to truly find himself. The journey isn't over, of course. Healing is a process, not an event. There are still moments, I know, when the old wounds ache, when the ghost of Thomas Miller's struggles casts a long shadow. But Mark faces them now, not with denial, but with an open heart. He carries the bird and his father's story not as a burden, but as a part of who he is. And for that, I am content. But there was one more thing that happened that year, something that surprised us all, a quiet twist that cemented the new path Mark was on. It happened much later when the snow had melted and spring was in full bloom, bringing with it a subtle yet profound act of remembrance. That final, simple truth seemed to unlock something deep inside Mark. The dam broke. A choked sob tore from his chest, raw and guttural, unlike anything I'd ever heard from him. He clutched the wooden bird to his chest, his shoulders shaking violently, his face buried against Sarah's shoulder. All the carefully constructed walls, all the years of pretending, of building a life based on a carefully curated narrative, crumbled in that single devastating moment. He wept openly and unashamedly, tears streaming down his face, soaking into Sarah's Christmas sweater. It wasn't just grief for a father he'd lost twice over. It was the pain of a lifetime of misunderstanding, of a wound he hadn't even known he carried. Sarah held him tighter, murmuring soft, comforting words I couldn't quite make out, stroking his hair. She didn't try to stop his tears, she just let him feel it all, a silent, powerful testament to her love and acceptance. Carol, standing by the kitchen doorway, had tears in her own eyes now, her hand still pressed to her mouth, but her gaze on Mark was no longer reproachful. It was filled with a profound empathy, a shared human understanding of pain and loss. She saw it, I think, the sheer weight of what he was experiencing. The grandkids, bless their innocence, looked up, a little confused by the sudden, loud crying, but quickly went back to their Lego, their small world still perfectly intact. For them, the adults' world was often a mysterious, emotional place, best observed from a safe distance. I watched Mark, my own heart heavy, but also strangely lighter than it had been in months. The burden of that secret, the weight of knowing, had been immense. And now it was out. The truth, raw and painful as it was finally free. There was no joy in his suffering, no triumph in seeing him broken, only a quiet, aching conviction that this had to happen. He needed to know. He deserved to know the man who had loved him, however imperfectly, however tragically. We let him cry. For a long time, the only sounds in the living room were Mark's ragged sobs and Sarah's gentle whispers. The Christmas morning, which had started with such bright, festive promise, had transformed into something else entirely, a crucible of truth, a moment of profound, painful reckoning. But even in that pain, there was a strange, undeniable beauty, a cleansing. A stripping away of falsehoods that had held him captive for decades. Eventually, his sobs subsided, replaced by the occasional shuddering breath. He pulled away from Sarah slightly, his face red and swollen, but there was a new look in his eyes, a vulnerability I'd never seen before, a raw, exposed honesty. He looked at the wooden bird again, turning it over in his hand, his thumb tracing the crude carving of the wing. It wasn't cheap anymore, it was priceless. A tangible piece of a love he'd been denied, a connection he'd yearned for unknowingly his entire life. He looked up at me, his eyes still brimming with unshed tears. "My mother, she never said anything," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Not a word, she just made him disappear." I nodded slowly. "She loved you, Mark, fiercely. She lived in a different time with different pressures. She wanted to protect you from the stigma, from the hardship. She wanted you to have a better life, a clean slate. She truly believed she was doing what was best for you." It was a difficult truth even for him to hear. The realization that his mother, the woman who had raised him, had built her love on a foundation of omission. It didn't diminish her love, but it complicated it, painted it in shades of gray he hadn't known existed. He had always seen her as strong, unwavering, the rock who had shielded him from a fatherless world. Now he saw her as a woman making impossible choices, driven by fear and love, trying to navigate a harsh reality. It was a more human picture of her, perhaps, but no less painful to absorb. Over the next few hours, the atmosphere in our home slowly, tentatively began to shift. The immediate storm had passed, leaving behind a quiet, reflective calm. Mark held that wooden bird, never letting it out of his sight. He asked questions, haltingly at first, then with increasing urgency. He wanted to know everything. About Thomas Miller, the man in the faded photograph. About his life, his struggles, his art. He asked about the prison, about the letter, about the messengers of hope. I told him what I knew, piecing together the fragments of a life I had painstakingly uncovered. Sarah stayed by his side, a quiet, unwavering presence. She listened, her hand often resting on his arm, her eyes moving between him and me, absorbing this new, crucial piece of their shared history. I could see the wheels turning in her mind, the re-evaluation of Mark's past behaviors, his guardedness, his need for external validation. It all started to make sense. It wasn't just about his father, it was about the profound impact of a buried truth on a person's identity. Carol, ever practical and nurturing, quietly started making lunch, the comforting aroma of soup and fresh bread filling the air. She didn't push, didn't intrude, but her steady presence was a grounding force. Later, she came and sat beside me, taking my hand and squeezing it gently. There was no need for words. She understood the weight of the decision I had made and the profound, if painful, necessity of it. In the days and weeks that followed, Mark underwent a quiet, profound transformation. It wasn't immediate, not a sudden, dramatic shift. It was a gradual unfolding, like a flower slowly opening to the sun after years in shadow. He started talking more about his past, not just with Sarah, but with me, with Carol. He began to process the grief, the anger, the confusion, and slowly, gently began to integrate this new truth into who he was. The expensive watches, the designer clothes, the casual mentions of his latest acquisitions, they didn't disappear overnight, but their importance seemed to diminish. He still worked hard, still provided for his family, but there was a subtle shift in his priorities. He began to appreciate things differently. He started taking an interest in local craft fairs, not to buy but to observe, to understand the hands that shaped simple objects. He even started sketching, crudely at first, trying to capture the essence of a bird, a leaf, a simple form. It was a way for him to connect, I think, to the father he never knew, to the lineage of creation that ran in his blood. He became more open, more vulnerable, more present. The guardedness that had always been a part of him started to recede, revealing a softer, more reflective man underneath. He started spending more time with the grandkids, not just playing, but teaching them to whittle small sticks into rudimentary shapes, sharing stories about his other grandpa, the one who carved birds. It was beautiful to watch, this quiet reconciliation, this embracing of a past he had once so vehemently rejected. Our relationship, mine and Mark's, deepened profoundly. The polite distance that had always existed between us dissolved, replaced by a genuine connection, a shared understanding forged in the crucible of that Christmas morning. He no longer called me Dad out of politeness, but out of genuine affection, a recognition of the difficult, loving act I had performed for him. He understood that my cheap gift was, in fact, the most valuable gift I could have ever given him, the gift of truth and the gift of his own history. It was a risky move, I know. It could have shattered our family, driven Mark away. But I believed with every fiber of my being that living a lie, however well-intentioned, was a far greater risk. The truth, no matter how painful, has a way of setting us free. It allows us to stand on solid ground, to understand who we are, where we come from, and what truly matters. It allows us to forgive, to heal, and to build a future that is truly authentic. That small wooden bird, once dismissed as worthless, now sits proudly on Mark's desk, a cherished reminder of his father, of the love that transcends time and circumstance, and of the profound journey he embarked on that Christmas morning. It's a symbol of hope, just as his father intended, a messenger of truth. Did you like my story? Please like and subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I want to know how far this story of mine travels. Sometimes the most valuable gifts are the ones that cost the least, and the most profound truths are found in the most unexpected places.